Hello and welcome to Politics Today. And in this programme today, we will be discussing the government's joint-up policy on not banning Hamas, the Islamic terrorist organisation, in its entirety, prescribing its military wing as a prescribed terrorist organisation and yet dealing with its political wing. So to discuss this contradiction in British policy towards Islamist terrorist organisations that are responsible for the death of thousands of people, the death of Christians, and also for really damaging the plight of the people of Gaza, it's important that we raise this issue. So in this programme, I'm joined by Michael McCann, who's the Director of Israel-Britain Alliance, together with Alistair Scott, the UK Director for Vision for Israel, also known as Joseph Storehouse. Michael, it's great to see you in the studio. We've been doing a lot of Zoom programmes together, so I really appreciate that. And you're looking well.
As are you, Simon. Delighted to be back.
Pleasure. So I'll start off with you, Michael, because this is one of the very important political campaigns that you're getting involved in, and you'd like the support of our viewers. Share with us your campaign to get Hamas prescribed as a terrorist organisation in its entirety, and why the government has decided to separate its political wing from its military wing when they are one and the same.
Well, anyone who examines government policy will find a whole series of contradictions in a number of different subjects, and foreign policy or the prescription of foreign organisations is one of them, because there's an element of deja vu here for Revelation TV viewers, Simon. Hezbollah suffered the same distinction. The UK government attempted to differentiate between its military and political wings, when in essence they had the same command structure and they were one single organisation. And it's exactly the same with Hamas. Hamas, the Arabic meaning of Hamas is courage, bravery, zeal. But of course, in reality, they're nothing of the sort. It's a vicious terror organisation, as you've just outlined. So the situation is that the British government has outlawed the military wing of Hamas, but it has not outlawed its political wing, which also has a charitable element to it in terms of a social services element. So it means that money can be piled into that element legitimately in the UK. But what the public don't know, or what most of the public don't know, is that money can then be distributed through the Hamas network to buy weapons, to fund martyrs, to fund shaheed, to pay salaries of people who have committed terrible crimes. And the bottom line is this: Hamas has started 3 major conflicts with Israel over the last 15 years or so. It has also killed probably around 6,000 civilians in that time, because it fires rockets from civilian areas deliberately and targets civilians in Israel. And Israel was forced to respond, and of course we then get the negative news cycle, which leads with Israel's response rather than the Hamas terrorism. So therefore it's time for the contradictions to end, and that's why we have just started our pre-registration campaign for our Ban Hamas campaign, which will go live mid-August, and we will be asking the government, asking Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, to outlaw the terrorist organisation Hamas.
Alistair, it's great to have you on the programme. I know you're fully behind Michael's campaign as well. But
yes.
I mean, you have to ask the question, really, and this is the way probably our Foreign Office thinks, that, you know, OK, we can't deal with the military wing of Hamas, but there is no real difference between the military wing and the political wing. And considering that this is a genocidal terrorist organisation, in its own founding charter in 1998, called not only for the destruction of Israel, but also for genocide against the Jewish people worldwide. What benefit does our government have to do to allow representatives of Hamas to engage in meetings with the Foreign Office and others, knowing that they pose a threat to one of Britain's closest allies in the Middle East?
It's ridiculous, isn't it? The way our government does separate the two organisations when they are one. And you know what you're saying just now about Hamas in the language is bravery and courage, but in the Hebrew language, the word Hamas means violence and violent people. So it's kind of an interesting difference there. But we can never understand why our government tries to be so politically correct. And there's a Western sort of mindset that if you negotiate, you can bring people around, but it doesn't work with Hamas, as you know, as I know. They're even within their political organization, they're one doctrine is to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. And we seem to say this so often in so many of these programs when we feature Israel and the Palestinians. But we really got to pray that our government gets, smells the coffee. Most of the times when these funding organizations for humanitarian aid, they are not accountable. So the money they collect goes straight into the violence, the attacks on Israel against the civil people, not against the armed forces. They are always going at civilian targets and using their own civilian people as their shields. So one hopes that the more people like Michael get these campaigns going and get into the right hands, with the backup of Christian prayer, somehow our government needs to really get the revelation that this is not the right thing to do, and not to separate Hamas, the governing authority, with Hamas, the political side, and the terrorist side, which is horrendous. I mean, most of the world understands what Hamas is all about, and some of the major nations like USA, Australia, Canada, don't separate, but our nation needs to separate, not to separate as well, and see Hamas is Hamas. It's a terrorist organization, no matter what guise they are trying to portray.
Michael, what do you it's a bit strange, isn't it, considering that our government is extremely pro-Israel, that many of our cabinet ministers have shown a kind of love and affection for Israel, including Priti Patel, our Home Secretary, Savad Javid, Minister of Health, and even Boris has claimed a great affinity and love for Israel, and yet they seem to want to negotiate with this genocidal terrorist organisation. But I have to ask you a technical question, though. Why are you directing this towards Priti Patel, our Home Secretary, rather than to Dominic Raab, our Foreign Secretary? Because it's surely the Foreign Office that is the one that's saying we want to have the political wing open so that we can enter into negotiations and talks with Hamas if we need to.
Well, I understand your dilemma here in terms of why you think it should be the Foreign Office rather than the Home Office. The reason's very simple. It's a Home Office responsibility to prescribe terrorist organisation under UK law. And therefore, that's why we are asking our supporters to contact a Member of Parliament in the first instance, to then contact the Home Office to create a virtuous cycle of correspondence to demand that Priti Patel takes action. Because the first contradiction that the British government has to answer is this. Those viewers in Northern Ireland in particular will remember the very delicate talks that the British government had with the terrorist organisation, the IRA. The precursor to those discussions is that the IRA had to give up its weapons and stop relying on if you remember the policy, was a ballot box in one hand and the Armalite in the other. So therefore, although some people will have very harsh memories and they won't be very fond about the decisions the UK government made, the bottom line is they forced that upon the IRA before they allowed them to enter into negotiations. The same logic must apply to any terror organisation. If Hamas wants to be legitimate as a political organisation, then give up your weapons. Stop demanding that a sovereign nation should not exist, which is the point you make about genocide, and demand that they give up their weapons in order to enter proper peace negotiations, because that's what we all want to see, peace in the Middle East. And what was the other point you were making, Simon?
The other point is it's surprising, considering how favourable our government is and ministers towards Israel, that this doesn't seem to be on the radar of our government at all.
Well, the problem with that is that the government speak with forked tongue, and with the greatest respect, they'll be great supporters when they're in the back benches, but when they become government ministers, then you get the clammy hand of the Foreign Office telling them that, well, listen, Minister, we have relationships with 27 other Arab countries. We sell them expensive items of machinery like aeroplanes and weapons and so on, and if we go too far on the Israel point, which is only a small nation, important nation but small, then we'll offend them. So there's this tightrope currently always being walked by the Foreign Office, by the Prime Minister, by the Home Secretary, by any government minister, which is to keep relations with Israel, which I fundamentally disagree with. Say, well, look, we're really your friend behind a cupped hand. But in actual fact, when they make decisions, they're taking account of those other relationships with the Arab countries, which they don't want to offend, which comes back to a strange point, another contradiction, but why they didn't full-throatedly support the Abraham Accords, which Donald Trump's administration brokered. First time that normalisation deals have been signed with the UAE and Bahrain. And, having a good friend of mine was the UAE ambassador, Eitan Nahi, used to be the deputy ambassador to the UK from Israel. He's living proof. He's negotiating with these new countries, new deals, which will bring prosperity to more nations in the Middle East. So lots of contradictions. But unless we get rid of the big ones, which is describing an organisation, a part of an organisation as not being terrorist when it is, getting rid of those big contradictions would be a good start.
Absolutely. And Alistair, I find very surprising, for example, that our British government hasn't acted on this one already. Just looking at the argument of the grounds on morality. Yeah. I mean, for example, Hamas took power in Gaza after they won the election in 2006. In 2007, carried out a coup against the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, kicked them all out. We saw members of the PLO being kicked off buildings. They took control. And so what we have in Gaza is a totalitarian, extreme Sunni regime, in which everything is under the control of Hamas. And they are a genocidal terrorist organisation supported by Iran. And of course, when Israel's had to defend itself against these rockets and missiles that literally have paralysed 2/3 of Israel, preventing people going to schools, going to hospitals, going to work, and Israel had no other choice but defend its citizens from these rockets and missiles. And we saw in 2014, Israel had to send in ground troops in order to destroy these terror tunnels and its rockets and missiles, to the condemnation of the world. But in terms of kind of the morality issue, what can the British government do that can change Hamas or its perspective when we know that they want Israel's destruction, and these are evil, vile people?
Absolutely. I mean, it's the point that Michael makes. It's the government says a lot of things, but really we need actions, and the right actions. Our government is always balancing finance, economy, and trade ahead of doing what is right. Human rights, the issue of human rights, which Israel gets challenged about all the time, no one seems to come against it in Palestine and the Gaza Strip and so on. So our government, I'm kind of surprised, in some ways, surprised and yet not surprised, that our government has separated the issues, because it's not even debatable, really. Anyone who looks in, does a little bit of research, visits, if you dare, as a politician, you would see the regime is totally a terrorist regime. It's a totally despotic regime that controls the people, and the thousands and millions of dollars, stroke sterling, stroke euros, that go in to supposedly help the people are never used for that. They're used just to bring about death and destruction over Israel. Their number one enemy. It's their one aim. And so what does it take for a government to wake up? I don't know. They are going to always want to balance this economy and please the Arab nations. But even the Arab nations are siding more with Israel than they are with Iran and the terrorist organizations. So our government...
There's a further bit of madness, of course, which is this. We pile in probably more than this, but in my day it was 100 million a year into the Palestinian Authority, and money was getting spent in Gaza. And every time there's a conflict, which usually does erupt because Hamas creates it, firing rockets into Israel, and then Israel, abiding by the international law of conflict, responds, and because Hamas hide their weapons and fire their weapons from civilian buildings, hospitals, schools, and so on and so forth, Israel hits those buildings, giving all the notice it possibly can, abiding by those laws of conflict to get innocents out of the way. The buildings are destroyed, and then the next thing is we're getting asked to pay for it as taxpayers to rebuild those very self-same buildings, which Hamas, the cycle that Hamas creates, have destroyed. It's the economics of the madhouse. But here it comes back to the reality. 100 million every year against the billions of pounds that Britain generates in sales to these other Arab countries. And that's where the FCO's clammy hand comes into that type of negotiation, which argues against good ethics and argues that, well, we should just keep quiet about this.
Yeah. And Alistair, I think we have to also look into the fact that by the British government separating Hamas into two entities from its military wing, which it prescribes as a terrorist organisation, and then its political wing that wants open negotiations with, is also leading to a massive rise in Jew hatred around the world and anti-Semitism in this country, because effectively our government is not dealing with Hamas as they should, and that is to support Israel, to ensure there's a naval blockade on Gaza, to ensure that weapons and rockets and missiles don't get into the hands of Hamas, to ensure that our nation, that Hamas are not able to fund and raise funds in this country to fund their military campaign against Israel. And I mean, recently I saw a horrendous video produced by Hamas in which it's a cartoon and the Israeli national anthem is sung. And effectively, this is Hamas taking over Israel, putting Jewish people on ships and murdering thousands, if not millions, of Israelis, and then saying we've won. So how the government can actually think that they can enter into negotiation with an organisation that doesn't believe in negotiations, has nothing to negotiate on, and it's a question of good versus evil, and that Hamas is evil. So how important is it that we need to not only pray about this, but also get involved in the campaign from Israel-Britain Alliance to put pressure on our government to do what is the right thing if we are to combat terrorism? Because if we don't, we know that same terrorism will come to these shores, and they have done over the last few years.
Absolutely. You've seen the rise of anti-Semitism globally, but in this country too, and recently and during the early parts of the summer, the kind of Taliban sort of stuff that was going through London and the attacks that have come physically on Jewish communities is terrible. And our government does say all the right things about, yes, we support the Jewish communities in our nation. Yes, we want to protect them. But as long as they continue to have these negotiations and accepting Hamas as the political wing, it's encouraging. I mean, the thing is, the Hamas political wing understand that they can get away with things because they can sit there and pretend to be talking and negotiating, but they're not actually in any way stopping the activity against Israel, stopping the activity worldwide against the Jews, and funding it as much as possible. And I think, what people like Michael are doing, they're doing these amazing campaigns, and as believers and Christians, we really need to get behind these things and challenge our governments, challenge our local MPs, challenge, go to whatever level you can. But it's great to have someone like Michael doing what he does, because we just support, we'll sign the letters which go off to our politicians, but he's doing the front line of it. And I'm so glad for people like him who are able to do that, because I know we've been challenged by Israel embassies over several decades as why are we so passive as those who support Israel? And you can see that as a government we're very passive, but as people, as in the church, we need to be far more active in our support for the likes of the work that Michael's doing, and go beyond that if you can, and challenge directly. Go into those surgeries of your politicians, your MP, and just talk to them. Let them know that there is a wave of support for Israel and against the Hamas thing. Because I think very often, I know we've had this when we've talked to politicians, they don't understand the difference between the Hamas political and the terrorist organization, and they don't really know what's going on. So we need to just feed our own MPs too, and support Michael all the way with his campaigns. I mean, we've been supporting him every time there's a letter. I get it to our local MP, and he always responds. So that's a good thing. But I'm not sure how many others actually follow the same line. But that doesn't mean we give up. We keep fighting. And Michael, thank you so much for what you do. It's great.
Thank you very much.
And Michael, often hear when it comes to Gaza that they were under occupation from Israel, but the reality is that Israel withdrew their Jewish settlements, over 12,000, back in 2005, and unilaterally pulled out of Gaza, which was then the Palestinian Authority was in complete control until the coup d'etat took place in 2007. And the oppression of extreme Sharia law placed on the citizens of Gaza being under Hamas's control is absolutely frightening. You can compare it to the Taliban in Afghanistan, for example, or ISIS control in northern Iraq or Syria. Yet our mainstream media don't portray it as this. They don't actually tell the truth when it comes to the danger of Hamas. And if anything, this campaign is important as well, isn't it, for the people of Gaza, that we want them to be free of occupation, but not of Israel, but of Hamas.
Absolutely. I won't repeat that because everything you've said is 100% spot on, but I think it's important to highlight that the other people who get persecuted by Hamas are Christians. There is no tolerance. There's a real problem for me in terms of these left-wing, the new term being woke individuals. That, you know, there's people, for example, LGBT activists, probably another few initials to add there, I'm not being disrespectful, but there's always changing, who are supporting. I saw people supporting Hamas in the last round of conflict they created with Israel. And I've said to people from that perspective, do you know that if you were in Gaza, you'd be thrown off a building?
Yeah.
You'd be murdered because they don't accept you. They don't accept you for what you are. There's no Christian ethics or morals around the violence they inflict. If you don't agree with them, that's you. They end you. So therefore, what really perturbs me in terms of the media in our country, the mainstream media, BBC in particular, which another campaign is coming soon on, as you know, is that if there's anything suggested that you could offend Islam, then that will not. They're in fear of. It's a Charlie Hebdo syndrome. They're in fear of saying anything because they know that the repercussions can be violence and death and murder. And the problem we have is that despite the fact that we're a Christian country, the UK Parliament every day, every session starts with prayers. A private session, only it's not televised. Private session. We're a Christian country. Starts with prayers, but yet our mainstream media won't report the fact that the persecution of Christians is across the whole of the Middle East, and it's terrorists like Hamas and other groups which are at the core of it, and Iran and all the rest of it, because everything goes back to that one giant bad apple in the Middle East, Iranian influence and Iranian hegemonic ambitions in that area. It's a bizarre thing that a Shia administration is funding a Sunni. Hamas is a Sunni organisation, but they quite frankly don't care who's murdering, who's torturing, who's killing. All they're interested in is creating mayhem in the Middle East and the destruction of Israel. And that's why, and I say this because there must be some Revelation TV viewers out there who haven't yet supported one of our campaigns. You know, it's a really crucial time for you to start. Your prayers are fantastic. Spiritual support is really important. But it's also putting your name at the end of that letter and sending it off to the politicians who make decisions, which is equally important.
Absolutely. And Alistair, I mean, you showed an example how you have signed up for these campaigns on behalf of Israel-Britain Alliance. So for any of our viewers watching this programme that haven't done so, just explain how easy it is and how important it is so that we give Israel a voice at the heart of our democracy, which is Parliament, and our elected representatives know the truth of the situation that Israel faces, because unlike Hamas, Israel is a democratic country. It has democratic institutions. It has freedom of press. It has freedom of religion. And Hamas is a totalitarian regime that oppresses its own people and also then fires thousands of rockets and missiles into Israel, doesn't care about civilians, puts women in the harm deliberately, women and children, when they fire these rockets and missiles, and then threaten the lives of journalists who are based in Gaza from actually not reporting the Hamas narrative. So it's important that we, as Christians, wake up to the threat that this faces Israel, and as a nation that we need to bless Israel, because we know that through Genesis 12, 1-3, that we will receive a blessing if we bless Israel, but we'll also receive a curse if we curse Israel. And it looks like this modelled up government policy is not right, and we need to deal with it.
Definitely. And I mean, you know, it's very clear, isn't it, when you look at the prophecies of Zechariah and Joel, that nations will be judged according to how they treat Israel. And and God's not going to be swayed by what you say. It's going to be what you do. You know, you can say all the right things and do nothing. So getting involved with something like the organisation Michael's involved, it's so simple for us because you don't have to go and do too much research. It's good to check out that what they're doing is lining up with your own heart. But the letters are pre-written for you. All you have to do is literally go online and agree to have the letter sent to your MP, and you put in your details, your name, your address, your email. and it's done for you, you know. And as I've said personally, I know every time I get a reply from our MP down in the Horsham district where we are now. So it's not hard work, but it is absolutely imperative we do it, because the government needs to know there's a large part of the population who don't agree with the policies they have to do with the whole Gaza situation, Hamas and so on. So, you know, I really would pray about it if you need to, but be active, because every ambassador I've ever spoken to at the Israel embassy has always challenged me and said, people don't seem to, they agree with us, but they don't do anything about it. So even now, as you're watching this program, if you can get in touch with the organization and sign up for it, it'll be great for Israel and for our nation too, because we want our nation to be blessed.
Absolutely. So, Michael, do you want to explain to our viewers? I've done so many programs with you as well, so I'm sure that a lot of our viewers watching will know exactly what I'm talking about. So, practically, how can they go about writing to their political representatives in Parliament, their MP, on the need for the government to ban the political wing of Hamas and not to negotiate with an Islamist genocidal terrorist organisation? And let's not forget that they are the ones who have caused havoc in Israel with the suicide bombings in the 90s and the Second Intifada. And because that tactic is not working, they are having now to resort to rockets and missiles.
Absolutely. Well, let me give you an encouraging statistic to start, Simon.
Always good.
In 2016, 1st of February 2016, in our first campaign, we sent 1,387 emails to members of Parliament, which equates to roughly 2 per constituency, although it doesn't quite work out that way. In the recent conflict that Hamas started with Israel, we sent over 18,000 emails in just 10 days to members of Parliament. And as has already been said, that's absolutely crucial, because it then influences the debate inside the House of Commons. Now, not only do we do all the research, prepare the text and make sure we don't get anything wrong in terms of our campaigns, but, you know, if you don't like a phrase, a sentence, a word, you can change that in the letter. Our system provides that. So all you need to do, as already mentioned, is your name, your Christian name, your surname, your email address. The system, once you put in your postcode, you click on your address, just as if you were buying something out of a store online. And then when you click the button, it gets sent off to your Member of Parliament or whoever else we're targeting. In this case, we're copying the emails into Priti Patel, the Home Secretary. Crucial thing is the campaign is up for pre-registration now, www.israelbritain.org.uk.
Excellent. Well, Michael, great to see you in the studio. Great to see you as Alistair. Great to see you both. And you work very well together. Thank you for watching Politics Today. And I think it's imperative as Christians that we get involved in this campaign, particularly to prescribe the political wing of Hamas, which is a genocidal terrorist organisation. Do it because it's the right thing to do. So thank you for watching this edition of Politics Today.